Good evening. I'm Kristen Welker. This is your news update. Vladimir Putin has built an impregnable fortress at the heart of Europe for years, and he believed the walls of this fortress could withstand any pressure from the West. But on the night of December 14th, it's not just the walls of that fortress that are shaking, its very roots are being shaken. Viktor Orban, Moscow's most loyal ally in Europe, is facing the biggest nightmare of his political career. On December 14th, Hungarian streets went viral worldwide on social media. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets with torches in their hands. These torches were not a show of love, rather were lit to burn down the Orban regime. Hundreds of thousands of people in Budapest demanded an end to impunity and the resignation of Viktor Orban, a collaborator with Russia. The parliament building was surrounded by tens of thousands of people, led by the opposition leader. As the opposition leader, Magyar, shouted that everything was over, tens of thousands of people called for Orban's resignation in a single voice. This was the voice of an entire country saying, enough is enough. Ruin and chaos were coming for the order established by Putin and his elite rulers. Just last week before, Russian influence in Bulgaria was shattered by a quiet but deep political earthquake. Now, it is not the aftershocks of that earthquake, but its main wave that has struck Hungary. These are not just ordinary protests or simple internal political issues. This is a strategic breaking point where the Kremlin's last seat at the European table has been overturned. Orban's government is wobbling, and for the first time, Moscow is truly feeling the cold, ominous breath of complete isolation on its neck. And just a few hours after the protests, that same night, Putin made a shocking statement to the entire world. Let's watch Putin's panicked speech as resignation protests against Orban unfold. While Putin is telling people that all the current hardships they are experiencing are not the result of Russia's hostile actions, as claimed by those with malicious intent, you must pay for the fight against the mythical Russian threat out of your own pockets. A superpower leader is addressing the entire world while hundreds of thousands of people are losing their lives on the front lines, while millions of people are starving and homeless in the heart of Europe, struggling to survive in inhumane conditions. And he says that the current problems are the result of years of actions, mistakes, short-sightedness, and greed by the ruling elites of these countries. It was the same when Georgia was invaded in 2008, when Chechen people were being massacred, when Crimea was annexed in 2014, and Ukraine. And it is truly significant that Putin is making this speech tonight. It is more than a coincidence, because his last stronghold, Orban, is about to fall. And Europe was finally standing up against tyranny, oligarchy, and Kremlin influence. Although everything seemed like a very familiar scenario in Romania a few days ago, this time the variables in the equation were completely different. This chain of events that erupted in Budapest began not with an opposition movement financed from outside, but with the emergence of Peter Magyar, a figure who came from within the system itself and knew the regime's codes very well. Peter Magyar was a former bureaucrat who had observed from within how Viktor Orban's power structure, media control, and pressure on the judiciary worked. And now his greatest weapon was this. Inside information advantage, the crowds that poured into the squares at Magyar's call represented much more than the classic opposition groups we were accustomed to. They represented an angry wave from every segment of society. Kossuth Square, the epicenter of the protests, had hosted many demonstrations throughout its history. But the energy and determination of tonight's crowd was unlike anything seen during Orban's 14 years in power. People waving not only Hungarian flags, also banners reading, "We are not afraid" and "Resign." We're shoving a reality that the government's media outlets tried to ignore, the reality of corruption and state capture, into the eyes of the entire world. The Orban regime had succeeded in consolidating the people for years with the rhetoric of family values and national sovereignty. But the allegations of corruption that came to light and the fact that the state apparatus had been turned into a party tool, painfully revealed how empty this rhetoric was. We must also highlight a technical detail here, namely the activity on the digital front. The protests turned into a simultaneous battle not only in physical squares, but also in cyberspace. The global hacker group Anonymous took the stage as the events unfolded, declaring open war on the Hungarian government and Orban's party Fidesz. This was not just a website takedown operation. It was a symbol of what the regime feared most, the uncontrolled flow of information. The messages published by Anonymous and the leaked data boosted the morale of the protesters while creating an atmosphere of complete panic and chaos on the government side. The fact that digital activism was so synchronized with actions on the ground proved how modern social movements have evolved, and that no iron fist leader can hide behind digital walls anymore. When images from the field are examined, it is clear that the measures taken by the police also confirm this panic. The security cordon around the parliament building was expanded, but the crowd was so large that these barricades remained merely symbolic lines. Torches and cell phone lights lit up the sky, turning the Budapest night into day. And this sea of light revealed how fragile the ground was under the Kremlin's most reliable partner in Europe. Orban's media empire tried to censor these images or portray them as small, marginal groups. But the power of social media and independent journalism instantly brought the truth to millions. When we deepen our analysis, we see that it was not just Peter Magyar's charisma that ignited these protests. This was the result of a social explosion caused by years of accumulated economic hardship, inflation, and the cutting of EU funds. Orban reaped the benefits of his balancing act between Brussels and Moscow for a long time. But now that balance has been upset. The people grew tired of their leaders restlessly fighting with external forces or Brussels bureaucrats and began to focus on the fire in their own kitchens, the rot within their own state. The TISZA movement, founded by Peter Magyar and rapidly gaining momentum, filled this void, offering people not just a protest, but an alternative. This alternative promised transparent governance based on European standards, not in Russia's shadow. At this point, we must also consider the intelligence aspect of the situation. It is not difficult to guess how closely Moscow was monitoring developments in Budapest. For Russia, Orban was not only a friendly leader, but also a Trojan horse within NATO and the EU. However, tonight we see that the wheels of that Trojan horse have been broken. The operations carried out by Russian intelligence services for years to maintain their influence in the region have been rendered ineffective in the face of this mass awakening of the Hungarian people. The propaganda machine has stalled, and disinformation campaigns have backfired. This investigation curtain in Budapest shows us one thing very clearly. No matter how powerful a regime may appear, when faced with a movement that comes from within, knows the system's weaknesses, and touches on the real concerns of the people, that power is gone in an instant. The Peter Magyar affair is not a simple political rivalry, but the collapse of a system's immune system. The heat of this fire burning in Budapest is warming not only the waters of the Danube, but the entire political climate of Europe. And this warming signals a meltdown far more dangerous for Moscow than global warming. If we view this event as merely an internal Hungarian matter, we completely miss the bigger picture, because this is not an isolated incident, but the second and most critical link in a geopolitical domino effect. Remember, just last week, Bulgaria experienced a similar political upheaval, and pro-Russian cadres suffered a serious loss of power. Now we are witnessing the same scenario playing out in Hungary, but in a much more violent and mass version. This is no coincidence. It is the collapse of the politics built on fear of Russia or admiration for Russia that has been going on for years in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Hungary's importance to Russia went far beyond being a simple trading partner. Orban was Putin's veto card within the European Union, a brake mechanism blocking aid to Ukraine, and a wedge slowing NATO's expansion. However, now, in a scenario where Orban is fighting for survival in his own home, in his own capital, this veto card is becoming completely ineffective. A leader whose seat is shaking cannot find the strength to pound his fist on the table in Brussels. This situation creates a strategic window of opportunity that we call the veto gap. The European Union and NATO will use this moment of chaos with Orban mired in domestic politics to accelerate aid packages for Ukraine and push new sanctions against Russia through their parliaments for Moscow. This means the fall of its diplomatic shield. This connection between Bulgaria and Hungary actually symbolizes the collapse of Russia's energy strategy. Russia tried to keep these countries in its orbit by using gas and oil as weapons. However, with Bulgaria's move towards energy diversification and regaining control over Russian refineries, combined with public anger in Hungary, Putin's energy blackmail doctrine has been thrown out. The Hungarian people no longer accept that the promise of cheap gas comes at the price of corruption and authoritarianism. The anger in the streets is blaming the economic crisis on close ties with Putin in a country where inflation has reached record levels. The government's tales of a strategic partnership with Russia are losing credibility in the face of empty refrigerators. This ripple effect will not be limited to Hungary and Bulgaria. Leaders in Slovakia, such as Robert Fico, who follow a similar political line, must also be watching the images coming out of Budapest with great concern, seeing that even a figure like Orban, who seemed untouchable and had absolute power, could be shaken by a popular movement, will create serious psychological pressure on other populist and pro-Russia leaders in Europe. This could be the beginning of a new trend that we could call the patriotic purge. European nations have begun to view their internal Russian extensions not only as a foreign policy choice, but as a national security threat and a source of corruption. From Moscow's perspective, the situation is a complete disaster. While the Kremlin is struggling with a military stalemate on the Ukrainian front, it is facing the collapse of its most trusted rearguard, namely its political allies within Europe, one by one. Orban's fall or weakening means the blindness of Russia's intelligence networks in Europe, the cessation of lobbying activities, and the blockage of financial channels. The data exposed by anonymous cyber attacks shows how deep these networks are, but also proves how vulnerable they are. The most tangible result of the ripple effect is this. For Russia, the war in Ukraine is now being lost not only in the trenches of Donbass, but also in the squares of Budapest. This is because one of the most important factors in breaking Ukraine's capacity to resist was the division within the West. Orban was the architect and symbol of this division. The wavering of that symbol means the Western alliance is consolidating again and presenting a united front against Russia. This was the Kremlin's greatest fear, and tonight that fear is becoming reality. When we place all these events on a larger global map, the picture that emerges is, in the truest sense of the word, a strategic checkmate position for Putin. The Russian grand strategy, meticulously crafted over years, adorned with Eurasianism dreams and aimed at dividing Europe, is being crushed under the footsteps of the protesters in Budapest. This event signals much more than the mere possibility of a government change. It marks the end of Russia's geopolitical presence in continental Europe. Because Hungary, when you look at the map, was Russia's last land bridge, its last lifeline, extending to the Balkans and Central Europe. And now that lifeline is about to burst. Under internal pressure, Russia's foreign policy strategy has always been based on bypassing the institutional structure of the European Union through bilateral relations, by establishing special relationships with Berlin, Paris, but most of all, Budapest. It aimed to render Brussels ineffective. Orban was the cornerstone of this strategy. The displacement of that cornerstone means the collapse of the entire structure. If Hungary returns to being a fully compliant EU and NATO member, Russia's intelligence bases, operational capabilities, and diplomatic maneuvering space in the heart of Europe will be wiped out. This would be the final nail in the coffin of Russia's confinement to its borders, condemning it to the status of a pariah state, a North Korea-like diplomatic isolation. It is worth recalling the concept of the patriotic purge here. The winds blowing through European capitals show that cooperation with Russia is now political suicide. The moment a leader shakes hands with Putin, they risk being branded a traitor or corrupt by their own people. Peter Magyar's rise is the most concrete proof of this. The public equates corruption with Russian influence. This mental shift shows that Russia's soft power has completely collapsed. Russian money, Russian gas, or Russian support are no longer enough to keep a politician in power. On the contrary, they drag him down. Another dimension of this strategic picture is its impact on Serbia and the Balkans. Hungary was Serbia's gateway to Europe and a protective shield for Vučić, Russia's other ally in the region. Orban's fall or weakening will leave Serbia completely surrounded, an island surrounded by NATO and EU members. This domino effect triggers a process that will also end Russia's historical claim in the Balkans. So every slogan shouted in Budapest echoes in Belgrade and Moscow, shaking the walls. From an economic perspective, this situation is a major blow to Russia's sanctions-busting operations. Hungary has occasionally turned a blind eye to circumventing EU sanctions or watered down these sanctions. In a new political equation or a scenario where Orban weakens, these back doors will be tightly shut. The Russian economy, already crushed under the cost of the war, will experience complete strangulation with the closure of these last commercial and financial windows to Europe. As a result, Putin's Fortress Europe strategy is collapsing by the will of Europeans themselves, even those who once sympathized with him. This is not an external intervention, but an internal rejection. Russia is no longer part of Europe, a partner or a pole. It is coded as a threat on the other side of the border that must be guarded against. The events in Budapest are the moment when this coding was certified and recorded in history. The great game has ended for Russia on the European stage. The curtain is falling, and only loneliness remains on stage. That great rupture, whispered only in diplomatic corridors, until then mentioned as a possibility in analysis reports, became a concrete reality. Tonight, in the blazing squares of Budapest, Putin's strongest bastion in Europe is being conquered, not by an army from outside, but from within, by his own people's cries for justice and freedom. Viktor Orban's shaky seat symbolizes not only the end of a leader, but also the end of Moscow's influence in Europe. The hundreds of thousands who filled the squares that night sent a single message to the Kremlin. There are no more allies to buy, no more governments to blackmail, and no more veto rights to hide behind. As Hungary awakens, Russia's European dream has turned into a nightmare. And in the morning of this nightmare, there is only one truth to wake up to. The walls have fallen. The allies have fallen silent. And Moscow, under the rubble of the war it created, is now completely alone. So what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel.